With us now, CNN's Matt Egan. What are the issues here when Elena and Sarah talk about the uncertainty, what type of tariffs this could be? These are wildly different tariffs he's considering. The fact that he hasn't landed on one is really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting and it's nerve-wracking from the perspective of investors. You see, look, no Liberation Day celebration on Wall Street this morning. We're seeing stock futures move solidly lower. There's a couple of things that we think we know about what's coming today. The White House says that these tariffs would take effect immediately. That's a point that has kind of unnerved some investors and economists I've talked to. Normally, you would want to kind of phase this sort of thing in, not do it all at once. A range of proposals are still being considered, including perhaps tariffs on just certain countries. But the most extreme option is this universal tariff of up to 20% that is apparently still under consideration. Now, we don't know if that's what's going to happen, but economists warn that that is what could be the most damaging. The Budget Lab at Yale found that if there's this 20% universal tariff on top of the other tariffs that are already in place, that would take the U.S. tariff rate up to 33%. That would be the highest since 1872 when the president was Ulysses S. Grant. Now, the Budget Lab says that this would do real damage, right? It would eat into everyone's take-home pay, their inflation-adjusted income, because it would increase prices, including on food, clothes, leather, computer, electronics, and even oil. Now, again, we don't know if this is going to happen. It's possible that the president ends up picking a far more modest choice here. But I do think the bottom line is the cost of living, right, is the biggest issue for many Americans. It's arguably why Trump got elected again. And yet, economists are not just saying that aggressive tariffs are going to fail to fix the cost of living. They're saying it's going to make it much worse.
Again, one thing that's notable, the announcement comes at 4 o'clock after the markets close. The tariffs will go into effect immediately. Investors looking for certainty, although as Elena just reported there, the president is saying he reserves the right to keep negotiating with countries on the tariffs even after today. That may not be the certainty investors are looking for. Matt Egan, thank you.
Thanks, John.
Very much. Kate.
Thank you so much, sir. Joining us right now is Mark Zandi, the chief economist for Moody's Analytics. Thanks for coming back in, Mark. Okay, so I definitely want to hear what you have to say tomorrow as well, but leading into today, when we still don't know exactly what he's going to roll out, best case, worst case scenario today, in your view, is what?
Oh, geez. There's no good case here, Kate. It's just dark variations on a dark theme. I mean, Matt mentioned a 20% kind of effective tariff rate across the board, across all countries. That may be the scenario, just because that's easier to implement. If they're going to implement them on day one, that would be the way to go. 20% would put the tariff back to where it was in the 1930s. That's the Great Depression, Smoot-Hawley. And presumably other countries would respond to that. They would retaliate because they would recognize that these tariffs are big and they're going to remain in place for quite some time. So you add that all up, that's a pretty dark scenario. That gets us into recession pretty fast. Just to give you context, we've run some simulations of what that might mean. The current unemployment rate today is 4%. In that scenario, you get unemployment that's north of 7%. So that would be a pretty significant recession. The alternative scenario, maybe the best case, worst case scenario, would be the so-called reciprocal tariffs. These are tariffs that would be designed to be specific to individual countries. So if a country has tariffs on our products or imposes other non-trade barriers on our products, we would raise tariffs to be consistent with those barriers and those tariffs. That would result in a 15% effective tariff rate. That would probably result in a recession, get pretty close, but not nearly as much damage. But as you can see, a boatload of uncertainty here. This thing can go in lots of different directions, none of them good.
And also, what Trump ultimately announces, they say the White House does, that it will be effective immediately. That is what they have said. How does that work?
Yeah, that's going to be tough. Now, maybe that's just signaling that these tariffs are going to be implemented, relatively quickly over, days and maybe a few weeks. If the reciprocal tariffs, that's complicated, right? Because it's country by country. You have to really work through the arithmetic, I assume, and that would take a lot of time. And then actually implementing that would be complicated because you've got different tariff rates for different countries, different products, so forth and so on. So, I'm not sure. I mean, if it's across the board, I suppose you could do that more quickly, but I'm struggling here, Kate. I'm not sure how you would do that immediately. But regardless, if we're at 15 or 20% tariff rate, the impact on inflation is going to be very significant. I mean, just to give you context, if we go to 20%, that will push the consumer price index up by a full percentage point and a half. So we'll go from 3% inflation, which is where we are today, to 4.5% inflation. And obviously, that's a real hardship for many Americans.
One of the things I've been struggling with, and there's a lot of questions around, is what's the policy driving this? Because there are two things that they have said, and I'm not entirely sure how they line up. The president wants to both raise revenue with tariffs and also use them as leverage to get other nations to lower their tariffs or make other policy changes. But if tariffs are subject to negotiation, as he's kind of discussed and alluded to, they could go away at any moment. How does that line up with leaning on this to raise revenue?
I don't know. I don't see it. I don't get it. I mean, if you raise the tariff rate, say to 20%, and you get a recession, the net impact of that on our fiscal situation is going to be very negative. Yeah, we'll generate more tariff revenue, but think about the hit to other taxes. Income taxes will be down, corporate income tax will be down, sales taxes will be down. And also it raises government spending with higher unemployment. That causes unemployment insurance costs to rise, SNAP, which is food assistance, rental assistance. So, and then of course, there's already a lot of talk about providing benefits, cash benefits to like farmers who are getting creamed by the fact that they can't sell into China because of the Chinese retaliation. You add that all up, I'm not sure we're going to raise any net revenue whatsoever. And then, as you point out, these tariffs are being done by executive order. It's not in a piece of legislation. So they can be here. They're here today. They can be gone tomorrow. So you can't count on these revenues, next year, let alone 10 years from now. So I'm totally confused by the thought that you're going to raise a lot of revenue here and that it's going to be sustainable revenue to address our long-term fiscal problems.
Yeah, because Peter Navarro had said very clearly that he's talking about numbers. This is how much we'll raise 10 years out, which is a question of how are these tariffs, can you anticipate this whole policy will still be in place 10 years out? Regardless, let us see what happens today. Important to get your take then tomorrow. Mark, great to see you. Thank you.
For more on this, we're joined now by Julian Ventura, the former Mexican Deputy Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He also served as Mexico's ambassador to China and the UK. Hi, Ambassador. So President Sheinbaum has largely adopted this wait-and-see approach to this trade war. Is this a winning strategy?
Well, I think it's a smart strategy. President Sheinbaum has played smart with a difficult hand. She's bet on dialogue and, as you mentioned, holding off on targeted countermeasures which are ready until the full picture is known. She's built a solid coalition of private sector stakeholders and developed a plan to increase domestic content and products manufactured in Mexico. But dialogue is ongoing. As we speak, Mexico's trade secretary is in Washington for the 6th or 7th week in a row to talk to Commerce Secretary Lutnick and the U.S. Trade Representative to try to come to an understanding which at least preserves, tariff-free trade for USMCA-compliant goods and establishes a roadmap to stabilize that relationship. As you mentioned, uncertainty and shifting goals are kryptonite for markets, investors, and consumers in the United States, but also in Mexico. And this relationship is huge.
Yeah, how do you think Americans will be impacted by this in terms of its relationship with Mexico and what could happen as a result of these tariffs?
Well, Mexico is the U.S.'s top trading partner. We're one of your biggest customers, the top customer of American goods for many states, all the way up from Oregon and Colorado down to Arizona, Texas, and California. A lot of jobs depend on North American and U.S.-Mexico trade. 14 million jobs in the region as a whole. We know that tariffs have an impact on consumer state of mind, on markets, on investors. So there's definitely going to be a hit if and depending on the scope of the tariffs that are announced by President Trump this afternoon. There's a lot of noise going around as to what the scope of those tariffs will be, but ultimately the buck stops at President Trump's desk, and we'll find that out this afternoon.